Welcome to Bible study. And in the spirit of something that would hopefully be helpful to everyone, we're going to do a 10 to 12 minute overview of the entire New Testament. So, lest you think that's impossible, put on your seatbelt, because I want to make sure as we step into these letters of Paul to do a deep dive that you have some context, historical context for that. And to do that, we'll use some slides, and this will be a review for many of you, and hopefully for everyone, you'll maybe pick up a few new ideas. So, first of all, we want to talk about the land. And to do that, it's good to look at the present-day Middle East, just to make sure we're all clear. There's a reason that Israel has been at the heart of so much of human history, because it's been the crossroads of trade routes to the Mediterranean and to the countries around the Mediterranean, which is, of course, meaning Middle Earth. It was the middle of the earth in the early years, in the early centuries, and everything revolved around it. So you can see Israel is a land bridge right here on the Mediterranean, with 3 continents in the north, Europe, the Middle East, and Africa in the south. And armies were constantly moving over it, and much of the Old Testament is the story of those shifting empires as they came into Israel, and not always for Israel's sake, but for trade routes' sake. So thinking about the land, if you think vertically, Israel's a very small country, but if we start with the Mediterranean, just like, for instance, California, there's a coastal plain, and it divides the country. Really, there are 5 parts of Israel. So the coastal plain is obviously next to the sea, and it's only about 10 miles deep, and you would feel very much like you're in a typical Mediterranean climate there. And it runs 3 miles wide in the north, very, very narrow, and about 10 to 15 miles wide in the south. The very next strip you hit would be foothills, just like the land moves up in other areas. So you hit the foothills, and those are from 300 to 500 feet tall. The third group in are the mountains, and the Israelites built their cities in the mountains. They were mountain people. And if you think about where you're going to be the safest from a military standpoint, it's always the highest elevation. So it was natural that they would build up. And the mountains are about 3,000 feet tall, and this is pretty much where their history takes place. The valleys are where the heathen were, and the Israelites were up tall. The very next area is the Jordan River Valley, and this is part of a very long rift that goes all the way down to Africa called the Transjordanian Rift. Now think about this. If you're looking at Israel, and this is the Mediterranean, so the land is rising, comes to mountains, and then all of a sudden there's a big trough, and that's the water that comes down from the Sea of Galilee in the north down to the Dead Sea. And that rift, when you fly over Israel, you can see goes all the way down into Africa. So that's the next. And then the final area is east of the Jordan. And that is an area in the New Testament that is literally named that way. Jesus goes east of Jordan, and you'll always know what that means. That's the land that rises from the Dead Sea, has mountains that eventually decline as you go into this area all the way into Syria. So just to get your bearings, this is a lot of Jordan today. The Gaza Strip down here, this was where the Philistines were. So Lebanon is up here where Tyre is. Tyre is actually the home of Hezbollah. It's one of the most dangerous areas in the Middle East, and where Jordan is 5 million people and 3 million are Palestinian refugees. These are very hot areas. The last time I was in Jordan, we were down at the Gulf of Aqaba, and a bomb came over from the Sinai, just sort of saying, hi, we're here. And you can stand in Eilat and look at Egypt, Israel, Jordan, and Syria. The countries are so close together. So as Henry Kissinger used to say, you can forget the Cold War between Russia and the U.S. It's the Middle East that's the nexus of the world. And you can see every president of the United States almost comes unhinged trying to create a Middle East policy. So it has been ever thus, and it was certainly that in the biblical times. As we go to the political divisions, this is a slide where it just shows the birth of Christ here in Jerusalem, down in Bethlehem, south of Jerusalem. He lived most of his life up in the Galilee, and much of our New Testament Gospels are the journeys up and down to Passover. That was always in Jerusalem, where Jews from all over the Roman Empire would come for Passover, their holiest day of the year. And we know Jesus went 3 times for Passover. The first time he wasn't known much. The second time he was almost stoned and disappeared in the crowds. And the third time crucified. And of course the resurrection occurs. So that's how we know his ministry was roughly 3 years long. So as we think about the provinces that are in the West, there are really 5 provinces that were political divisions. The Galilee is primarily where Jesus' ministry was, and you'll recognize all these cities, Capernaum, Nazareth, where he grew up. And then you have Judea in the south, named after the ancient country that split when David was king, Judea in the south and Israel in the north, and then the whole thing became Israel. You have Perea over on the eastern side. This would have been the area where Moses would have come in and died before he got into the promised land. The Decapolis, and then you have an area up here where Caesarea Philippi is called Bashan. And so those 5 provinces were political provinces. And in the early years, the political situation was constantly changing. The kingdom under Herod the Great, who was literally the great Herod. We know many Herods like Antipas and others. He had 10 sons. Even Herodotus, whose daughter Salome danced, and John the Baptist lost his head over it. That was a daughter of Herod the Great. So she took the male name and they added a female ending. The Herod family was enormous, but it all started with Herod the Great. And his kingdom was in fact a kingdom that the Roman Empire, which had by now taken over this area, gave him. He was kind of a Jew by birth, but hated by the Jews because they felt like he was much more of a Roman infiltrator than he was a true Jew. And so he was always balancing between the empire and what the Jews of his own country wanted. At his death, and he had a long reign, he'd be like Queen Elizabeth today. You know, does anybody know Queen Elizabeth and Victoria and the Elizabeth I, 3 longest reigning monarchs in the history of Europe, and she's coming up on an anniversary where she'll take over all of the other 2. So Herod the Great was like that. He was on the throne almost 40 years, and the Temple of Jerusalem was the great building project under his reign. So that's what gave a great deal of employment to the city of Jerusalem. It was Herod the Great's building program, building on the ancient temple that Solomon had built. So Herod the Great died, and the Romans decided, we're not going to let anybody have that much power anymore. So his son was given, the territory was divided into 4 parts, a tetrarchy, and his sons were given pieces of it. And eventually, it was put back into a kingdom. But when we enter the New Testament, at Jesus' birth, Herod the Great is on the throne. And he's the one, you recall, that wanted to kill the baby boys, terrified that there would be a competitor to his throne and his power. But by the time Jesus takes on his ministry at the age of 30, as a good Jew would, because you can't go public as a rabbi until you're 30, one of his sons was on the throne, and it was no longer a kingdom, but a political tetrarchy. And the Romans put a man named Pontius Pilate over this area. And of course, he is now an always to be known figure because of his role in the great trial of Jesus Christ. So that's a little bit about the politics. So in 44, Herod Agrippa died. This is AD, and his son Herod Agrippa II became ruler, and the bulk of Palestine goes back to Roman rule. So it's a long way of saying the Romans were always present. It would be just like us having another country occupy the United States.